Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and you've heard me say this many times before. There are many wonderful men and women helping to shape Jewish life today, helping to forge the Jewish future. And then there are the few superstars, incredible individuals who, with that charismatic blend of mind and heart, enthusiasm, profound insight, and personal strength of character, the whole package, are able to elevate us in a way that makes us proud of our Jewish heritage and excited to be part of the Jewish people, to learn more about our Jewish tradition, to be more involved with the state of Israel, to expand the sense of Jewish identity that is at our core, who inspire us to be better Jews and better human beings. On this edition of L'Chaim, lucky us, I have the enormous honor and pleasure to introduce you to a Jewish superstar, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, who may well be the most formative and influential popular author and speaker on the Jewish scene today. Even if you know who Joseph Telushkin is and you've read one or more of his superb books and anthologies, let me run down just some of what this man has done. Joseph Telushkin is the author of the most widely selling book on Judaism of the past 20 years, entitled The Most Important Things to Know About the Jewish Religion, Its People, and Its History. He is also the author of more than 15 other books on Jewish literacy, ethics, and humor. His 2014 book on the Lubavitcher Rebbe, The Life and Teachings of Menachem Schneerson, the most influential rabbi in modern history, was a New York Times bestseller. Among Joseph Telushkin's wonderful Jewish anthologies is one of the most significant of Jewish humor, What the Best Jewish Jokes Say About the Jews. Joseph Telushkin is the co-author with his childhood friend Dennis Prager of one of the most formative Jewish books of the last 40 years, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. Joseph Telushkin is also an accomplished novelist, and his An Eye for an Eye was the basis of 4 episodes of the Emmy Award-winning ABC series, The Practice. In fact, Joseph Telushkin has been a regular TV writer, including an episode called Bar Mitzvah for the TV series Touched by an Angel, in which Kirk Douglas played an older man who returns to Judaism. And if all that were not enough, Rabbi Telushkin serves as rabbi of the Los Angeles Synagogue for the Performing Arts, and another of Joseph Telushkin's influential books has just come out in a fully revised edition entitled Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, How the Words You Choose Shape Your Destiny. It's published by William Morrow, a division of HarperCollins. It is so fabulous to have you at this table. You know I've wanted to sit with you for many, many years, and now we've been able to do it. I thank you for making the effort and for joining me here on L'Chaim.
Mark, L'Chaim is an excellent show. I'm honored to be on L'Chaim, and after such an introduction, my only fear is it can only go downhill.
Oh, no. Oh, no. Everybody's,
Okay.
I'm in, and everybody's in for a wonderful treat. So I want to know, before we talk about your writings and your philosophy, who the heck are you? I want to know that first. Where were you born?
Okay.
And who were your mother and father? And what kind of Jewish home did they bring you up in? How did you get to be Joseph Telushkin?
Okay. I grew up in Brooklyn, where I attended the yeshiva of Flatbush. My father, Shlomo Telushkin, alav hashalom, was an accountant, and among the clients he had, he was the accountant for the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So that's how I was known in Chabad. My father is actually buried in the cemetery where the Rebbe is buried, as is my grandfather, who had a long relationship. My father had a very blessed career in a certain way, because it was not super lucrative, but he was the accountant for organizations he believed in. So he was also the accountant for Mizrahi, the religious Zionists, Ezra Torah, which helped poor rabbis. And it was a very wonderful person.
And this is the model you grew up seeing.
This is the model I grew up seeing, and my mother, Helen Resnick, grew up in Borough Park, and so I was living in a modern Orthodox home. I had a very close relationship. My father's father, Nissen Telushkin, was a very prominent rabbinic scholar, and I would learn with him. So it was very blessed.
Do you think your mother and father had a profound influence on you personally?
Yes, they very much did.
Were you close to both of them?
I was close to both of my parents.
And I'm just fascinated. What was your father like as a person?
My father was an Anav. He was a humble person. And he was very simple and straightforward. My ability to be humorous, which I got from my mother. My father was not a particular jokester. My mother loved funny stories and loved to tell funny stories. My father was a very straightforward, everything he did, my father was about the most honest person I've known in my life. Everything about him was very straight. And he was a patient person, not have a temper. And I had tremendous admiration for my father.
And the tone of your mother, in addition to her love of humor, was?
My father was a man, I'd say, of simple faith.
Yes.
And I don't mean to be simplistic, but it's simple. My mother was of a more skeptical. My mother had a somewhat more dour view of the human condition. One of her comments that she used to make was, "The only people I know who are happy are people I don't know well." Or there's the famous line of Thoreau's, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation," which my mother rewarded to, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, and recently they're not so quiet." Or she had another great line. She said, "When it's not terrible to be a Jew, it's wonderful." So she had an influence. That line, "The only people I know who are happy are people I don't know well," very much influenced my friend Dennis Prager, who my mother knew well because Dennis and I met in the 10th grade at the Yeshiva of Flatbush and became very close. And I remember when she said that, Dennis said, "Helen, I'm going to make that quote, I'm going to make you famous for that quote." And he really has. He really has. I remember in the early 90s, I had occasion to meet and befriend Jack Kemp, the congressman who had run for vice president. And I remember Joanne Kemp, his wife, said, "Is your mother that philosopher that Dennis likes to quote?" So it was very funny.
Yes. Only child?
No, I have an older sister, a beloved older sister who lives in Brookline, Massachusetts.
What's
Shalva.
her name?
Shalva.
Shalva.
Yes.
I only can assume this from all the work you've done, and even as you describe your home, a modern Orthodox home with learning everywhere around you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming you grew up loving being Jewish. Fair enough?
Yes,
okay.
Definitely.
Your sister also?
Definitely, yes.
Okay. You're in Brooklyn. I didn't ask you. Were you a Dodger fan?
Yes, but I remember I was very young when the Dodgers moved out because I was born in 48, they moved out in 57. I do remember going to Ebbets Field for a game, and I do remember having a profound dislike for was it Walter O'Malley, the one who moved the Dodgers out of Brooklyn? Yes, that was a heartbreaking experience.
It was, yes.
Yes, it was.
Did you stay a baseball fan or no?
I became a bit of a fan of the Mets when they came back, and in recent years, living in Manhattan, something that I never would have expected when I was younger, I became a Yankees fan.
It's unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I was a rabid Jackie Robinson Dodger fan.
Of course.
And I saw in the Dodger, the mantra of "wait till next year."
Right.
Was it was a Jewish hope that one day we'd return to Jerusalem, and then they left, and it was very heartbreaking. But I hated the Yankees.
Yeah. Oh, my son Ben, who's here with me, knows that we loved the movie 42. The movie about Jackie Robinson.
Right.
And I've actually been very interested in Jackie Robinson. I came across, and I actually quote Jackie Robinson in my book, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, the great story which showed that he not only, that he not only, that he clearly had a good heart, but he also had a very bright head. And of course, one of the great disappointments in Dodger history was in 1951. They end the season tied with the New York Giants, and they go into a 3-game playoff, and then they're winning the 3rd game. They're ahead 4-2. It's the bottom of the 9th because they're playing in the Polo Grounds, and Bobby Thompson gets up and hits a home run with 2 men on base. So they win the pennant, and Ralph Branca, who had been one of the Dodgers who had acted always appropriately and kindly and warmly to Robinson, was a young guy in his mid-20s. He goes back to the locker room. Nobody's talking to him. He's crying. I found out later that in those days, what players earned in the World Series could almost equal their earnings for the year. Today, obviously, baseball players are very well paid, but in those days they weren't. And he's crying. And at first, Robinson goes over to him and says, "Don't take it personally," which, of course, is ridiculous. How could you not take it personally? And then he said the words that Ralph Branca said he remembered for the rest of his life. He said to him, "If not for you, Ralph, we wouldn't have gotten this far." And so that's part of the words that heal, is they really do have to address the needs that people have. You can't just say, peripheral comments. You can't just make these sort of empty generalizations. Oh, have faith. You need to know what's really hurting the person and what can give the person a sense of redemption.
Since you did write a book about words that hurt and words that heal, I want to tell you a very, very quick story about Jackie Robinson and me.
Oh, good.
Okay. So I'm a child. I love him. And for all kinds of reasons. And I get to meet him once when he comes to speak in Connecticut to a men's club type Jewish thing. And I get lucky. I end up sitting with him in like the cocktail area, the booth with him and my father and a couple of his friends. When he drove up, he was not wearing a Dodger uniform. I was shocked. When we have dinner in this large room, and then everybody's leaving, and I'm in the back, and again he's met me, and I'm one of the only child. I've been the only child there.
Right.
And I scream out at the top of my lungs, "Don't forget me." Don't forget me. And all the men laugh. And he had a very high-pitched voice. And over the laughter comes Jackie Robinson. "I won't."
Wow.
You talk about words that heal and words that somehow have a profound impact.
Yes.
He didn't have to say that.
Right.
And it doesn't even matter whether it's literally true or not.
Right.
But I walk around with that all the time and think to myself, I hope I'm the kind of person who would say, if a child said something to me, "I won't."
That's a fantastic
Isn't
story.
it?
It's a fantastic story, and it underscores one of the points I make in Words That Hurt,
Yes.
Words That Heal, which is that the most important things about healing words are not that they are eloquent. The most important things are that they are said. People think, because we have a tendency, if something's said in a very witty or eloquent manner, we're more apt to remember it. But from the perspective of the person who's been hurt, the most important thing is that the words are said. Alan Dershowitz, who's sort of the last person in the world who you'd think would have had any sort of complexes when he was growing up, writes in one of his books, "I was 15 years old before anybody ever told me I was smart." And he grew up, not surprisingly, if you know Alan Dershowitz, and I know him, he's a friend, I have the greatest admiration for him, and he was a bit of a wise guy as a kid and got in trouble in school. In fact, he got in trouble so often that his mother was so often coming to the principal's office, his friends thought that she worked in the school. And he said when he was about 15 or 16, he went to a Jewish summer camp. He was working as a waiter, and he became friendly with the drama counselor there, who was like a man in his early 20s. And they would talk about the things that people talk, teenagers talk about, religion, girls, world affairs. They're trying to form a view of the world. And one day this fellow says to him, "You're really smart." 5 words. It's the first time anyone had ever told Dershowitz he was smart. And he said he knew this guy was not a flattering sort. And he said, "How would I live differently if I really was smart?" He claims those 5 words changed his life. The drama counselor was Yitz Greenberg, who, of course,
my goodness,
later on became such a major rabbinic figure, and in my own life, because Yitz performed a Devorah in my wedding. So, and then our children went to SAR, the day school that Yitz and Blue played such a critical role in founding. So these 5 words, again, they were said, and that's the whole point, that the words need to be said. And it's terrible that many people will say critical things, but the affirmations, the affirmative words, right, to have Jackie Robbins say, I won't, meaning I won't forget you, is something you're going to carry for the rest of your life.
That's correct.
And if people thought in terms of those affirmative words, the amount of good, because we are all familiar, when I wrote the original edition of this book, it largely focused on Lashon Hara, how words are used to hurt people, and the detrimental effects of words. And I more than tripled the size of Words That Heal in this, because I realized if there's something as dangerous as words that can hurt and do so much damage, it would really be an unfair world if there was no compensatory mechanism. And Words That Heal can overcome so much of the hurt that's been done to people.
Okay, I wanted to talk about you, but I don't want to let this thread go. So we'll come back to you in a few minutes.
Right.
By the way, you know, my guess is there's nothing I can tell you don't know already. However, there's a great quote by Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Yeah.
Something like, I used to admire people who were clever.
Right.
Now I admire people who are kind.
Right.
And that's in many ways what you're also doing in your book.
Yes.
I want you to speak for a moment. The power, the human dimension of power that lovely words have. And I want to know, Joseph, why do you think kind words come so hard to people? People can be sarcastic easily. They can be cutting easily. They're often shy or reticent to be lovely and kind. Why? I want to know both. I want to hear you talk about why words have this power, and then I also want you to talk about why you think it is people have such a hard time expressing them.
Okay, there are obviously a few reasons, but one of the things that occurs to me, people like to sound smart. It is much harder to give a compliment in a way that makes you sound smart, and it's much easier to be cutting. That's why I, as a rule, will almost never write reviews of books unless I have a good reason to feel I like the book. Because unless I feel that the writer is being malicious, it would be very hard for me. I know how hard people work on books. And then you come up with some, witty, some witty line that makes a person, sound ridiculous, and then it becomes what people associate with the person. And then you're thought of as being quite smart. Whereas complimentary words don't seem to have that. But when people can find complimentary words, they really make an impression. What is it? Carl Sandburg, I think, said of Abraham Lincoln, because he wrote a biography of Lincoln. He said, the day God created Lincoln, he didn't have to do anything else. You find a way that really catches the air, catches the real sense, because it's a terrible thing. When you think about it, and I always say to audiences, I said, unless you have been the victim of terrible physical violence, chances are the worst pains you've suffered in life have come from words, from sharply worded criticism, from outbursts of anger, from gossip, from rumors. I'll often ask in an audience, how many of you ever had a nickname you hated? A lot of hands go up, and it really caused people an immense amount of suffering. There's a lot of cruelty in human nature. It's a part of us, and it's such a liberating thing. I recently was talking about this with my wife. One of the ideas I would love to have is that if people would undertake that when they've been a guest at somebody's house, that for at least a few days after they leave the house, they will say nothing critical about their host's children, their host's household furniture, and the hosts also should refrain from doing it, because so many nasty observations are made. Another way to avoid being unfair when you speak about other people, never speak about another person for more than 3 minutes. And I'll tell you why. If I'm speaking to a group of 200 people and I'll say, I want to divide this group up into groups of 2, 100 groups of 2, and speak for 20 minutes about someone you know in common, how likely is it that you'll say, oh, you know that story that shows how nice she is? I know an even nicer story. What's most interesting about people is what's not so nice about them. My wife, Devorah, worked for 12 years for Isaac Bashevis Singer. She started out as a sort of a secretary, and then she was doing editing. She studied Yiddish at Columbia. She was editing. She was translating short stories. And one of Isaac's lines was, even good people don't like to read novels about good people. And it's true, because what's interesting about people is what's not so nice. So that if people would restrict speaking about other people to no more than 3 minutes, they're unlikely to start really getting into it. If you and I are talking about someone we know in common, and I say to you, I love that guy, he's a fantastic person. There's only one thing I can't stand about him. Obviously, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the one thing. So that's why when I did Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, I wanted people to first come to an awareness. I'll ask an audience, I'll say, how many of you can think about at least one episode in your life that you would be highly embarrassed if everybody else here found out about it? And of course, everybody's hands goes up. Anybody whose hand doesn't go up, I said, either has a very bad memory or has led a very boring life or is lying. You know, and people all laugh. And then I say to them, how would you feel towards a person who spread that information? You'd regard that person as a vicious and cruel person. Yet the truth of the matter is, when you raised your hands, I was wondering, what's this episode they're concealing? You look at me, you wonder, what am I concealing? And because it's innately interesting. One of the reasons even the Torah is innately interesting is because it reveals dimensions of behavior that we wouldn't always necessarily think is that elevated. Stories about saints can get a little, stories about saints who have no Yetzer Hara, who have no temptation towards evil, can get a little boring. So therefore, we have to develop what I call moral imagination. The 20th century witnessed extraordinary advances in science and medicine and technology because a group of people, of individuals, used the full resources of their intellectual imagination to solve problems that had been previously thought insoluble. The 20th century is a mixed bag on moral advances. I certainly don't want to, obviously we think of things like the Holocaust, but I don't want to just say there were no advances. There are advances. The situation of women has improved. The situation of minorities has improved. People who have, disabilities, people who have mental problems or physical handicaps. There have been a lot of improvements. But obviously, there's also been more mass murder in the 20th century and 21st than there had ever previously been. And part of the reason is people rarely use the full resources of their moral imagination. One of the stories I tell in Words That Hurt, Words That Heal is about a Rabbi, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who lived in Israel. He was a beloved figure. He came out of the very frum Orthodox world. And he was also known, though, as being wise and a bit more worldly than some of the people who were followers of his. So people would often consult with him on problems. And one day, a couple show up at his office. And I actually know the story from his biographer, Hanoch Teller, who assured me that this is really an accurate story, because I really try and trace stories because, obviously certain figures inspire stories that might not be totally accurate. So they show up at Rabbi Auerbach's office, and it turns out that their son, who is mentally challenged, has now sort of finished with the schools in Jerusalem that could deal with him, and the best solution would be to send him to a residential school, and there were 2 possible schools, and they wanted Rabbi Auerbach's opinion as to which of the 2 schools would be preferable. So Reb Shlomo Zalman said to them, well, what does the boy think? And the parents looked at each other abashed. They had never thought to consult with their son. So he said, Chatatem lenefesh hayeled, you're sinning against the soul of your child. Don't you realize one day he spent every day of his life in your house. Suddenly he's going to be put into a different environment. He'll feel expelled, exiled, alienated, hurt. you can't do that to him. Come and bring him to him. So the parents come back with the child, and Rabbi Auerbach says to him, Eich korim lecha, what's your name? And he says, Akiva. And he then says something very surprising. He says, Ani Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Ani Gadol Hador. I'm Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. I'm the greatest rabbi in the world today. Now, of course, this is not the way he would normally speak. He was a humble man. But he had a reason for saying it. He said to the boy, I want you to go to the schools. I want you to see which one you like. And when you choose the school you want to go to, I want you to go as my shaliach, as my messenger. And to enable you to be my messenger, I know you have many things. You know about Shabbat, you know about keeping kosher. You have many things you could teach other people. To enable you to be my messenger, I'm going to give you smicha, rabbinical ordination. And he gave the boy rabbinical ordination. My friend Chanoch said that having spoken to the parents, the boy would sometimes not come home on Shabbat because he had work to do there, because who had given him the work? The Gadol Hador, the greatest rabbi in the world today. So that's what I mean by moral imagination, to come up with a solution that could so strengthen the person and to save a person from a situation that could be so devastating. But you have to be smart, and you have to be willing to use, but you don't have to be a genius. If you really put yourself into the position of the other person and start to think, what would he need? Jackie Robinson, when he heard you say that, don't forget me, he saw there was a young guy there. And what he needed to know was, guess what? I'm an important person. And that's why it's amazing what people could do. And it just leads to being happier. People who gossip a lot and other things are not normally very happy people. Yeah.
Add what you're saying to the role of parent.
Mm-hmm.
Because so often people will say later in life, it's what my parents either didn't say to me or did say to me that had a profound impact in how I view myself, how I feel about myself, and talk about words as they apply to children.
There are a few things that I think are more important than a belief that your parents really care about you. They're the first, over there looking at my son.
Yeah, why? How many children do you have?
We have 4.
4 children.
I have 3 daughters, and our youngest is my son Benjamin.
He's in the control right now. You
Here.
studied with him this morning.
We did. We indeed studied. We were studying Pirkei Avot, the
That's
ethics of the
wonderful.
fathers.
That is
yes,
fabulous.
I love learning.
By the way,
with Ben.
isn't it wonderful? I'm getting chills even thinking it. Isn't it wonderful for you as a father to study with your son?
It's so pleasurable.
And you know, it's not typical of the world we live in.
No, it's not. It's not. And that's, one of the things I advocate people to do, I have not yet done it myself, is the whole notion in Hebrew of what's called a tzava'ah, an ethical will. I remember the rabbi who I first heard really speaking about it is, who you probably also know, Jack Reamer. And because when we hear the word will, as in last will and testament, we assume that it only is dealing with the issue of disposition of assets. Who got what, was it distributed fairly? But an ethical will is where you leave behind also a sense of what values you want your family to perpetuate. And I suspect that in families that got ethical wills, like where there were an insistence that the family try and remain united, that they not get involved in fights and arguments, it's going to have an impact. Because I'm always shocked when I'll ask a large audience, in what percent, how many of your families are there relatives at the level of first cousin and closer who are not on speaking terms? I will usually get an answer of about 1/3. I have had less occasion to ask this question to audiences largely comprised of non-Jews, but when I do, it tends to be also rather similar. The thought, for example, of God forbid if someday any of my children were not speaking to each other, is terrible, and I always say it's about the most disrespectful thing you could do to your parents. Unless there's the most extreme sort of instances, fights break out, and people do very hurtful things. So parents model a lot for children, and one of the most important models is that the children love each other and act well towards each other. And words, and certainly the perceptions of children, of words are very, very important. And a lot of people are not. I think in certain societies, parents tend to often be a little withholding of love and think that they have to constantly improve their children, and often can be very critical.
They also compare
Oh
children.
my God, the worst. That is the worst.
The worst.
Yes, and you can't. I was a bad student growing up in school.
Impossible.
No, Dennis Prager and I, when we became very close at the yeshiva of Flatbush, in those days they used to rank us.
Yes.
So we had 110 kids in our grade.
Yes.
I was 83rd. Dennis was 92nd. I stopped saying.
Just goes to show, right, Joseph?
Well, I've stopped saying that. I don't say it because a friend of mine, Effie Buchwald, once said to me, it's just a reverse form of bragging, because obviously things turned out better. But the principal of the school was not particularly nice to me, and my grandfather, this rabbi, once said to the principal, he said, Joseph's going to do very substantial things in his life, and you'll be ashamed that you spoke to him like that. And that was and my grandfather made it known to me that he had said that. And that was a very big thing. You need that affirmation.
Yes, what's interesting is evidently no one in Alan's family, including his parents, never said to him what Yitz Greenberg said to him years later.
That's what Dershowitz said. I've asked Dershowitz about that incident a number of times, and they didn't, because he probably was the sort of kid, he was very close to his mother. I know that because at a certain point, that friend I mentioned earlier, Effie Buchwald, once did an evening with Alan Dershowitz's mother, Joe Lieberman's mother, Dennis's mother, and my mother. And it was very funny to hear them compare. One of the questions they asked my mother was, does Joseph have any traits that you don't like? And my mother, at that point, it was a few years after my dad had died, my mother said, I'll tell you one trait Joseph has that I do like, which is he calls me every day. And if I started talking about traits he has that I don't like, maybe he would stop calling me every day. And, Dershowitz's
mother was very bright.
She was very bright. And Dershowitz's mother, he would say, when he was attacked on a radio show, she would call up and really let them have it, which is, sounds like Alan Dershowitz. And I remember Marshall Lieberman, Joe Lieberman's mother, said, and how do you react when Joe is attacked? And she says, I think, is there some truth to this? What can we, so it's funny the way people come out of those sorts of environments. But Dershowitz was very close to his mother, but he probably was a handful. And yet, and getting it from an outsider, as Jackie Robinson saying what he said to you, what Yit said, and obviously when it comes from within the family. Remember the songwriter Alan Sherman?
Sure.
So Sherman grew up pretty atypically in the late 30s in a single-parent household because his mom had been divorced, and it was less common then, certainly in Jewish life. And they didn't have much money, so they were living with his grandmother. So one day, Alan Sherman is 8 years old, and he hears his grandmother saying in the morning, he knew his grandmother was having a party that night, so she's saying in the morning, I need a football. He had no idea why his grandmother needed a football, but he's an 8-year-old boy. He wants to be the hero. So he goes out to procure a football. He can't get one, and then some bully in the neighborhood punches him, but then ends up agreeing to give him his football for Sherman's best toys. So he gives the toys, he gets the football, he polishes the football till it shines, and leaves it downstairs for his grandmother to find. Oh, his mother comes home, and all of a sudden, she's shouting out at him, says, Alan, why do you leave your toys around? He said, it's not for me, it's for Grandma. What are you talking about? She says, yeah, Grandma said she needs a football. His mother starts laughing at him and says, you don't understand your own grandmother? She needs a fruit bowl. So he is so humiliated and embarrassed, he runs up to his room, slams the door, and won't come out. The guests start coming over, and his mother comes up and says, Alan, your grandmother insists that you come down. He comes down. His grandmother's walking around with a very large fruit bowl, beautiful fruit, and in the middle is the football. And when one of her brothers says to her, why are you carrying around a football? She tells the story and then says in her, sort of Yiddish English, from a child is beautiful anything. And those words healed his heart. So, that's the point.
That's a fabulous story.
Isn't that a fabulous story?
It's a fabulous story.
Yes.
Yes. That's why your book is so wonderful. Words that hurt, words that heal. And I want to remind you of what you just said. The first edition of the book was more about words that hurt. It was a smaller book.
Mm-hmm.
When you added the words that heal, it tripled in size, something like that.
No, well, the section on words that heal tripled
Yeah.
in size, yeah.
So it's one of the things that everyone should, and I believe it's the most important thing parents can understand.
Yes.
What they say to their children, the words they say to their children, including, you're fabulous, you're wonderful, you are wonderful, you're bright, and you're smart, and you're beautiful, and you're wonderful. And in the end, you know, every human being needs to hear it from people who aren't one's parents.
Right.
But it begins with parents, and
Yeah.
so it's just a lovely thing you've done. It's a lovely gift you don't know. And I want everybody to know this book, which is a gem of a book. Joseph Telushkin is ready to send you a personalized signed copy of this book, Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, to anybody who is supporting JBS. And at the end of the program, we'll let you know what that means. But this is very kind of you, and it's not only kind of you, it's kind to the audience that you're going to help get this book out.
Oh, my heavens, definitely. Mark, it is so profoundly touching to me that you realize how important it is for people to work on this, because it's one of the hardest things to change. And, you know, I'll say to people often, I'll say, if you can't go for 24 hours without drinking alcohol, you're an alcoholic. And if you can't go for 24 hours without smoking a cigarette, you're addicted to nicotine. And if you can't go for 24 hours without saying something unkind about or to someone, it means you've lost control over your tongue. And regaining it will involve a real effort. And that's what I'm trying to set out to do, to regain control over how we speak about and to others. Because again, as I said, unless you're the victim of terrible physical violence, this is where so many of the hurts come from.
You know, when you talk about the power of words and where you've been, and as you look at the arc of your own life, has there ever been an experience, a Dershowitz type experience for you? You've referred to one already, but as you think about your life, what are the things that were said to you that had an impact in terms of what you wanted to do with your life?
Well, as I told you, my grandfather's comment,
Yes, very
which was
important.
one.
Yes.
When I've been told look, the truth of the matter is what you just said 2 minutes ago really has impacted me. I want you to know that this has such a capacity to help, and I know it. And people have told me over the years, you know, a woman came to me once who was having issues with her daughter, had found out her daughter had done some shoplifting and other things, and we spoke about ways to speak to her and what you could do, and that turned out to be helpful. So that's very, very profoundly moving, and just, you need that encouragement to know you're going in a certain direction.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And, you know, I have big dreams about changing, affecting people for the better in terms of Judaism and others, but then you become like a specialist. And to me, the issue of words, the issue of helping people learn how to curb their anger, to help, most importantly, helping people learn how to be fair when they argue with others, how they be fair when you're angry.
And by the way, I was just about to ask you,
Right.
and I don't want this to be a political discussion at all. I'm not asking you about Donald Trump.
Okay.
I'm asking you about the ethic today, where people have such a hard time talking to each other without getting angry and without saying very cruel things. Comment on that from your perspective.
Anger is terrible for a variety of reasons when uncontrolled. Obviously, there are situations where anger is the only appropriate response. You don't want to live in a city where the police force doesn't hate violent criminals, you know, and people should, certainly the acts of the criminals. But people, when they get angry, have a tendency to lose all sense of proportion. My friend Rabbi Erwin Kula of Klal, has often made the point, people have a tendency in an argument to think they're 100% right and the other side is 100% wrong. He said the only way to avoid demonizing the person you disagree with is to try and search out, are they 100% wrong? Is there any partial truth in what they're saying? Even if you think their partial truth is only partial and your truth is majority, do you really assume that you're 100% right and they're 100% wrong? And the reason that's so dangerous is this. If you assume that that other person is just a stupid person, okay, so you attribute it to his stupidity. But if you know that that person in other areas is actually intelligent and yet is still espousing such an evil position, then you inevitably are led to demonize them. So you end up with a situation where about half of Americans think the other half of Americans are either stupid or cold-hearted. And that sort of demonization is so terrible. And I can think of 3 instances in Jewish history where that's happened, that sort of demonization. The first, I say this to an audience of people who've gone to Israel. Almost everybody who's gone to Israel, certainly Jews who've gone to Israel, has visited Masada. I also say to them, how many of you see something heroic and admirable in the people of Masada? And most people will say yes. How many of you are familiar with Yochanan ben Zakkai? He was obviously the leader of the pro-peace forces. And the people I said at Masada not only thought he was 100% wrong, they literally would have killed him. In fact, he had to be snuck out of Jerusalem in a coffin because he was in danger of the zealots, of the people who favored the revolution, killing him. Yet now, 2,000 years later, we find things to admire in the people in Masada, and we find a lot to admire in Yochanan ben Zakkai. He's generally thought of as the one who guaranteed Judaism's continuity. And yet, they were each convinced of the total wrongness of the other side. 18th century. You had this great scholar called the Gaon of Vilna, and you had the rise of the Hasidic movement. The Gaon so hated the Hasidic movement that he actually said, if it was within my power to do to the Hasidim what Elijah the prophet did to the priests of Baal, I would do it. Which meant that if it was within his power, he'd kill the Hasidim.
Destroy them, literally.
Yeah, literally destroy them. And he made all sorts of edicts. You couldn't marry with them. And yet, 200 years later, guess what? People think the Gaon of Vilna was the Einstein of Judaism. And the Hasidim they see as having been an important movement. And the third example, which is much more recent, I'll ask an audience, how many of you, from what you know, have a high regard for David Ben-Gurion? And once again, obviously the large majority. He was the founding prime minister of Israel. How many of you have a high regard for Menachem Begin? The large majority of people do also. I said, what did Begin and Ben-Gurion think of each other? Ben-Gurion at one time actually said, if Begin ever becomes prime minister of Israel, he'll rule over Israel the way Hitler ruled over Germany. Then realizing that even by Jewish standards that was a little excessive, he said, I'm not saying that Begin doesn't hate Hitler, but the fact that he hates him doesn't mean he's unlike him. Now it so happens very late in life, Begin and Ben-Gurion did reconcile. But the point again to be made is, at the time a fight is happening, it's so hard. You have to keep control of your senses. And it's so tempting to attribute terrible motives to the people who disagree with you. And it has a very, very detrimental effect. And it makes hateful attitudes very common.
Talk to our audience about Elu ve'elu.
Okay, that's interesting.
How does what you're saying come right out of Jewish tradition, in essence, almost halacha? Explain.
Okay, so you're referring obviously to a famous statement. There were 2 rabbis and 2 schools that they founded that had many dozens, even more than dozens, of arguments in halacha.
And
in
there
Jewish
were times
law.
when they were very, Shammai was not nice to Hillel. The whole school was, I mean, there were periods of real enmity.
Well, okay, so this addresses an interesting point. Right, there are 2 traditions about it. One tradition says that they were getting along okay, and even though they had differences in laws of marriage and other things, they would marry with each other. And another tradition says there was a time when the fighting got so extreme that Shammaites were trying to kill Hillelites.
Yes, a moment.
Yeah,
there was
right,
a moment.
Yes. So it is an unusual Talmudic story. So as the Talmud puts it, as you know, of a heavenly voice, what's called a bat kol, comes out of the skies and says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim v'halacha kehillel. These and these are both the words of the living God, and the law is according to Hillel.
And when in the Drash, when it's these and these are the words of the living God, the text is referring to
the positions each of them have
yes,
taken.
so that heaven is saying, and then there's the coda to it, but what heaven is saying, that in a debate between the two most important schools that are the foundation of Talmudic and Rabbinic Judaism, heaven is saying they're both right.
Right.
And then it says,
and the law is according to Hillel.
and why does in the Drash, why is that?
Okay, no, and then it goes on to say, so if both of them are the words of the living God, why do we prefer Hillel? And they said, because the Hillelites also studied the positions of the Shammaites and even studied them first. So I don't think it's simply that they're saying that the Hillelites, had acted in a nicer way. I think because the Hillelites studied the positions of those who opposed them, I think they also reached a more intelligent conclusion. Very often we find now, and this has been one of the negative byproducts of the whole internet world and other things, I increasingly find people who only seem to read and listen to things with which they already agree.
Yes.
And so the positions that they oppose end up becoming straw men. You have to read the people who disagree with you and see, is there something there? Again, as my friend Irwin put it, is there a partial truth there? So I think the Hillelites could see the partial truths in Shammai's position and on occasion even retracted their positions. There's no clear-cut case. There's one vague case. There's no clear-cut case where the Shammaites ever retracted their position because they weren't open to seeing partial truths on the other side. So it's not only that reading the other side makes you a somewhat better, more humble person, it also makes you a smarter person.
So I fear today we live at a time when people are convinced they're the only right and that the other side is, as you said before, either stupid or worse.
Right.
In some way malevolent and evil, and it's one thing for it to be true about American society, and that pains me. It just tears me up that the Jewish community has fallen into that abyss.
Yes.
You agree?
Oh, I think it's terrible. Yes. No, again, I think it's very dangerous. Because when you start attributing bad motives to the people who oppose you, you can have a profound disagreement with someone. But when you start thinking of them as being either stupid or bad, then there's no grounds for coming back together. Why should you consider anything that they do? And that's, of course, very detrimental in Jewish life, and it's terrible in American life, and we're all feeling it.
One more thing, and boy, this hour has gone by. I cannot believe it. I asked you one question, and here we are. You tell a story, which now I tell all the time, about the way in which somebody describes what happens to an individual who carries anger around inside and is not able to forgive. Can you talk about that for one moment?
Yes, if it's the story that I think you're talking about, it's two stories, it's two separate analyses. I heard one from Harold Kushner, who's a man I deeply revere, and Abraham Tversky, Rabbi Abraham Tversky, Rabbi Doctor, the psychiatrist I also deeply revere. And Rabbi Tversky became a psychiatrist in the early 1960s. He's an older man now, and his area of expertise in psychiatry is addictive behavior. And in the early 60s, addictive behavior, was generally referred to alcoholism. By the late 60s, it meant drugs also, and now it means all sorts of self-destructive behaviors. The problem for recovering alcoholics is how do they avoid that first drink? Because that's exactly where they start to lose control. And a recovering alcoholic said to Twersky, he said, I know when I'm most tempted to drink, when I'm in a conflict with somebody. You know, the sort of conflict where you wake up in the middle of the night, you have to go to the bathroom, and then you can't fall back asleep because you keep going over in your mind. And he said, so what I learned was that carrying around a grudge is like allowing the person in the world whom you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free. It's such a profound line. I'll repeat it because it applies to everybody who's listening, whether or not you have any issue with drinking. Carrying around a grudge is like allowing the person in the world whom you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free.
Brilliant.
Yeah, brilliant. And Kushner, Rabbi Kushner told me there was a woman in his congregation whose husband had up and left her for another woman, a younger woman, and did it very suddenly, and then to boot, even after the divorce, did everything he could to weasel out of making payments and stuff. And Rabbi Kushner said, when it first happened, the woman was so overcome with fury, and he totally empathized and totally understood it. But 10 years later, when her fury remained unabated, he said, you've been walking around with a hot coal in your hand, ready to throw it at your ex, and all you've done is burn a hole in your hand. And again, so the realization, there are instances in Jewish law where you are not required to forgive. In the overwhelming majority of cases, if somebody has hurt you, and the hurt they inflicted on you is not irrevocable, and they sincerely want forgiveness, you have to offer forgiveness. But if somebody doesn't ask for forgiveness or has inflicted upon you an irrevocable hurt, you are not
irrevocable, by the way.
Irrevocable. You are not required to forgive, but there are reasons why you should. And otherwise, you're carrying around a terrible burden. When you forgive, even if it hasn't been asked for, you should tell the people that they did hurt you, because sometimes it turns out people who've hurt you don't even realize. My wife always makes this point. They don't even realize how much they've hurt you. But nonetheless, there are times when you have to rid yourself, because otherwise you just did it. I once had an incident. I was in a contractual arrangement with somebody who I felt was not being fully honest with me. And I was thinking about it. It eats you up. And then I worked out an arrangement. I paid the person a certain amount to withdraw something I had given him, and then it stopped bothering me. But other people who had dealt with this person, they would periodically call me up. They couldn't let go of it, and I felt terrible for them. And I said, try and find a way to settle.
We talked about the fact that you were born in Brooklyn. You went to
the Yeshiva of Flatbush.
Yeshiva of Flatbush, and you were there. Your friend Dennis, that's where you met your good friend Dennis Prager, lifelong
We were
friend.
sophomores in high school.
Okay. But we didn't go further. So what happens to you after Yeshiva High School?
I went to Yeshiva University, and my junior year I spent at a yeshiva in Israel. I came back and I studied for smicha, for rabbinical ordination at YU. And
you received smicha there.
And I received smicha, and then I subsequently went to Columbia University, enrolled in a doctoral program in Jewish history, and I did not finish my doctorate. I passed my orals for my doctorate. By then I'd started doing popular writing, and it can become hard to go back into academic writing after you've done popular writing. Dennis and I had both been very involved in the Soviet Jewry movement, the protest movement to get Jews out of the Soviet Union. So I met through that movement wonderful, wonderful people, and Dennis and I were doing a lot of speaking on the subject, but we came to realize that different sorts of audiences were still asking similar sorts of questions, because we spoke before Orthodox groups, conservative, Reform groups, Hadassah groups, federations. And we started identifying questions that would come up. Do I have to believe in God to be a good Jew? Who needs Jewish law or organized religion? Isn't it enough to be an ethical person? If Judaism is supposed to make people better, how do you account for unethical religious Jews? How does Judaism differ from other value systems, humanism, Christianity, Marxism? Why do many young Jews feel alienated? The sorts of questions that still come up. By the way,
what you identified are the most essential, basic questions that are in some way eternal, but they're certainly part of our age. It wasn't, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, today, every one of those questions is as relevant as it was when you first addressed them.
It's very gratifying to both Dennis and me that the book has remained in print and continues really to sell.
You know, I told you before, I adore you. What you have done, the contribution you've done through your writing and your teaching, it is as wonderful as any that any Jew has made in this century.
Thank you.
And I am so grateful to be a friend of yours. And and you always have a place here in that chair. You've got to promise me to come back again.
I will come back.
And in the meantime, thank you for this.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you for writing it.
Good.
And thank you for letting me offer it to our audience.
I'm very happy.
Kol tuva hatzlacha to you.
Toda rabba.
You should go from strength to strength.
Thank you.
And share it with me all the time.
Excellent.
Thank
Toda
you.
rabba.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to do that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, author, speaker, teacher extraordinaire, who's making a profound contribution to Jewish life and Jewish learning. I hope you've enjoyed meeting him here on L'chaim, and that you'll make a point of making Joe Telushkin's books part of your home library, including Words That Hurt, Words That Heal, How the Words You Choose Shape Your Destiny, published by William Morrow, division of HarperCollins. And Joseph Telushkin has been kind enough to say that we can give this book away with his personalized signature to any one of you who is willing to support JBS with a tax-deductible donation of $100 or more. For $100, you not only get a fabulous book, which will touch your heart, and it may change your life, but you'll also get it signed by Joseph Telushkin. Our address, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And if you would like a book, you just send us your donation and make a note that you would like to receive an autographed copy of Words That Hurt, Words That Heal. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed on this edition of L'chaim by Joseph Telushkin. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from all of you. And if you want to be in touch with Rabbi Telushkin, you email me and I will forward your emails on to him. Also remember, you can now listen to the L'chaim podcast, found on iTunes and Google Play, wherever you download your podcasts. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.